And then, okay, we'll do a review from last week. I want to move as fast as I can through the review so we can get through this chronology, or at least get most of it done without getting stuck halfway through it. Last week we just sort of concluded going through the statements one by one, verse to verse in Revelation 11 to kind of pull through some of the questions there. I think we had left off the week before with whether there's literal or figurative fire coming out of the mouths of the two witnesses, and whether it's literally coming out of their mouths or merely at their instruction or at their command. I won't go back through all of that. It's on the previous study session, but I offered up my understanding, which is that there is actual fire, that it does actually kill people. I'm not dismissing the idea that their words will also be a source of contention or tension or aggravation to others around the world, tormenting them with the truth. But I think there's also this element of them being able to defend themselves and harm those who would do harm to their cause and to them and God's purpose there. We talked about briefly about the plagues. We'll talk more about those going forward. We did have mention of Moses turning the waters to blood, that plague of Elijah preventing it from raining, and then, as it says, all manner of plagues as they will. And we'll talk about that as we look at chronology some, and then also as we look at I think we should connect that statement about their plagues to the plagues that are discussed in chapters 15 and 16. I noted that according to verse 7, the beast kills them after their testimony. And so we're going to address this question of, when did the two witnesses die? Did they die in the middle of this 7 years, or did they die at the end of this 7 years? And we'll talk about that in conjunction with the associated events and other things. And so let's see. I don't know if I called this out specifically last week. We'll mention it again. Verse 11 of chapter 12 has a statement dealing with those who are accused but overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. And so we're going to kind of have to look at that verse and its statement about the testimony and overcoming, and yet they love not their lives unto death, it says in that verse. And so we're going to have to look at that and see if that is how that may connect with some of these events in chapter 11, or in general with this period of persecution and martyrdom for saints, as it were. Let's see. And then the last thing we talked about, verse 8, referring to Jerusalem as Egypt and Sodom. And I'll just bring out what I did last week, which is that both of those locations have in common Abraham's family, either his descendants or, in the case of Sodom, his nephew Lot and his family, being escorted by two figures from a place where they are under Gentile oppression and wickedness, before God brings destruction to that place, or through that destruction, the destruction comes to that place. And we connected that to the possible flight of the woman in the wilderness, or to the wilderness in Revelation chapter 12, which again brings up some timing issues. So with that said, I'll jump into the chronology component. So I just want to make note of this, that I do intend, or as long as everybody else would like to at some point discuss this issue of a rapture and resurrection at the beginning of the 7-year period. I think it's something that a lot of people believe in. A lot of us have either believed it in the past, maybe still have family members and people who ask us about this, and we certainly haven't studied it like as a focal issue at any point in time recently. So it's certainly something worth visiting and considering the different points of view. But because this study is intended to be a study about the two witnesses, which largely deals with things going on during the 7 years, I didn't want to get sidetracked on what could easily become its own topic, which is a discussion of the possibility of a rapture and resurrection event at the beginning of the 7-year period. But we will discuss other rapture resurrection events, or the possibility at least of them, at the midway point and the end point of the 7 years. And so that's kind of my intention. And so what I want to do first is just set out some key events that we all, I think most people will have on their timeline in agreement with one another, and then we can kind of hopefully use those if we can establish their placement to decide where other things are at. So largely we're going to be looking at whether or not certain developments, certain actions, certain figures are active or occur in the first half of the 7-year period or in the second half of the 2nd-year period, or whether they occur at the midway point, like if there's a specific instance of something, it's like this is when this happens, or if they happen at the end point or around those, with those sort of being the main bookmarks that we're using. And so what I want to talk about, well, I guess I can ask this question, and you guys may see this stuff up here on my screen. I'll scroll down. Can anybody think of some of the major activities or events in the end times, either from the book of Revelation or from elsewhere in their studies in the scripture, that occur in this period that we're going to want to map out and see where that fits with some of this other stuff? Talked about the 2 witnesses. Anything else spring to mind?
2 of the main ones I think of, what Paul indicated in Thessalonians that are key indicators is, 1, there'll be a great falling away, presumably of the saints or the so-called people that are supposed to be Christians, but a great falling away that occurs, and then the son of perdition or whatever is revealed, the man of sin that he revealed. Those 2 things are 2 key factors that must occur, I think, towards the end time that he talks about.
Yep, there you go. There's 2 of them from 2 Thessalonians. Good. Anybody else want to add some to the list, or at least you're maybe thinking about some?
There's a battle that's described in Ezekiel chapter 38 that has been supposed to happen sometime either before the signing of the covenant or shortly thereafter. The time element has really not been disclosed, and it's unclear. Some have put it before the signing of it, during the signing, shortly after the signing. But there's a battle described there in Ezekiel chapter 38 where enemies from the north come down to the land of Israel to take a spoil. Now, as I understand it, that battle is different from that of Armageddon, because these enemies, when they come in from the north, they're coming to take a spoil, whereas in Armageddon, they're coming against that city to destroy it. So there's a distinction to be made with regard to these 2 attacks.
I think we will. So first of all, I think those are that's an important event to figure out where it's at, right? Is it something that happens to sort of initiate the 7-year period, or at the beginning of the 7-year period, early on in the 7-year period? Is it at the end of the 7-year period, and what that information in Ezekiel 38, 39 is indicating? And I think we're going to have to visit that maybe next week to try to
jumping ahead.
What's that?
Am I jumping ahead?
No, I'm glad you mentioned those, because I've been focusing on events as they are mentioned in the book of Revelation first, and so that's what we're going to look at tonight. But it's certainly right to include that. It is something that Ezekiel seems to indicate is happening in the end of the age, which has generally been my understanding of that passage. And so I think it hasn't been something we've spent a whole lot of time together on, certainly in our studies recently, to say, hey, okay, this Gog-Magog war, as Ezekiel uses this language, when is that? There are reasons, as Kevin mentioned, that people want to distinguish that from Armageddon, and in other schools of thought, some people have put it as the same as Armageddon, and so we'll want to get into that. So you may have seen me write that down. I want to make sure we come back and talk about that. The other thing that Kevin mentioned is this signing of the treaty, which is mentioned, or at least by inference, the normal understanding I think that many people have about Daniel 9:27. I'm going to kind of ask to put a sort of promissory note on discussing that because 2 reasons. One, I don't have a conventional view of what that verse is indicating. I think in most of the backgrounds that most of us have, and then maybe this is Kevin's referring to, that the Antichrist signs a treaty. Hey, I dropped out there for a second. Can you guys hear me again?
Yeah.
Yep.
I don't know if it was me or if
I
it was
wasn't
you.
sure if it was me. Yeah, no, I think you were freezing up for a bit there, but I don't know if it was just me, my computer. But yeah, you were.
No, it looked like over here that it dropped. So let me see if I need to start the recording again. It looks like it's still recording, which is pretty awesome. Okay, so I'm gonna ask if I can have a rain check on the peace treaty, the treaty that most people think about when they go to Daniel chapter 9:27, and again under the same sort of banner that I want to discuss things that happened during the 7 years. Although obviously, if there's a peace treaty signed at the beginning, that's pretty informative for depending on who the parties are and what that treaty allows for. It's also, important to know whether there's a rapture before this, because that also has implications for who's active when. So I'm certainly not meaning to take a pass on it, but I want to start at least our discussion of chronology with the things that are mentioned as occurring during the 7 years. Again, as I said, focusing on the question of first half, second half, midway point, end point, and see if we can straighten that out, because there's a large number of events and activities that I think have to be sort of pieced together and decide, okay, what do we think this is if we want to be informed about this. But those are definitely two good ones to remember, and I wrote those down so we could do that in the weeks ahead. So let's see. We got a couple of things there. I'm going to give you guys a broader list of the stuff that I included. Go ahead, John.
Go ahead, John. Or do you want stuff like a great earthquake?
Yeah, that's fine. That's great. That's great.
The sun becomes black, moon color of blood.
Yeah.
I think because some of these are ones that may get mentioned multiple times, and we kind of got to figure out, are they different ones or the same ones? But I don't know if that's going to be a part of this study. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to look at, because we're going to have to figure out what the order and how the relationship is here. Even for people who take a look at the book of Revelation. So when people read through the book of Revelation and try to determine chronology, there's a couple of different ways that are more standard understandings of how the book of Revelation conveys chronology, particularly with regard to the part of the book that pertains to the vision of the future. And by that I mean the part after the letters. Not to just completely dismiss or discard people who think the letters have some kind of prophetic information, but the vision that is the component that talks about all these world events that take place at that time. For the most part, that component of the book, people either take it to be A to Z, chapter 4 and chapter 5 are the beginning of that, and you just run all the way through it in order until you get to the final events at the end. And I certainly agree that the things in chapter 4 and 5 are early in describing essentially John's participation in this, or in the first century, being able to see it and the revealing of this. And then the end chapters obviously pertain to the things after this tribulational period and judgment and that. So in general, I think that's true. But in the meantime, when we're dealing with things in the 7 years, people will either just take it as A to Z. What you read first comes before what you read next. Other times people will take the sequences of the seals, the bowls, and the trumpets, or I should say seals, trumpets, and bowls, which are presented as components of telling information through symbol in some ways in the book of Revelation, and they'll lace them either one seal, one trumpet, one bowl, or they'll order them so it's all the seals, then all the trumpets, then all the bowls. If you guys take my meaning, I don't think that either one of those methods works quite as well as we would like it to, and I think Revelation has a little bit more of organic way. There's other methodologies in which, and I've always compared it to early Genesis, right? So if you read through Genesis 1, you get this pretty standard series of events. All the 6 days of creation, and the seventh day, the day of rest. Day 2, or Genesis chapter 2, immediately takes you back to a context on day 6 of Genesis, chapter 1. It's an expansion of information in Genesis, in the chronology of Genesis chapter 1. The Genesis chapter 1, just wanted to tell you the overall series of events of creation. It wasn't going to pause and give you the some more important material on day 6 of God putting Adam in the garden and the creation of the garden and animals being brought before Adam and the creation of Eve. We don't see that elaboration in chapter 1. We just see the basic series, days 1 through 7, and the components of what's built. Chapter 6 expands upon that, going back in time to a day 6 event, and then you move on to chapter 3, which has events later on, and then chapter 4 follows chapter 3, generally speaking, although at the end of chapter 4, you have this long digression into the several generations of Cain's descendants. And then chapter 5 starts with the restatements of the line of Adam's descendants through Seth. And so there is not a straight A to Z chronological sequencing of Genesis 1 through 5 in particular. And there are other places in Scripture which also follow that sort of format. And I think for a Jewish writer, that might have been a fairly familiar way of doing things. And I would just offer that I think there's some of that very reasonably going on in Revelation. Now, my purpose of this study is not to present the rationale behind our chronological interpretation of the book of Revelation, but rather that what you're going to see me doing tonight, which is attempting to determine certain events and their order and where they're placed, does not follow one of those more straightforward standard looks at Revelation, either the A to Z or the all of the bowls, all of the seals, all the bowls, then all the trumpets, or 1 trumpet, 1 bowl, 1 seal, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, that sort of thing. I'm not following that method because I don't think it holds up. And you'll see, I'll try to point out some of the places where I think and why that's going on. But just a list of.
I was just going to say, but as you stated, it does follow an established pattern that's already there, right? So it's not. This isn't.
Sorry, John. Go ahead.
No, that's all. I just wanted. I wasn't backtracking on what you were saying. I was just affirming that you've mentioned several different models, and this isn't one that you just sort of came up with on your own. This is something that we see this pattern present.
Yeah, and elsewhere in Scripture, I think there would be precedent for it. So let's. I'll give you a list of the things I want to take a look at that are all sort of mentioned specifically in Revelation. The building of the temple and the onset of temple activities, I think, is either inferred. Some of these may be directly more from Daniel, but the abomination of desolation, that's going to be one we're going to talk about. It's going to be kind of one of those key markers, milestones. Revelation 12's flight of the woman into the wilderness and being cared for 1,260 days. The stopping of temple activities, as Daniel 9:27 seems to mention. I think that's going to happen. Then we have the 1,260 days of the prophecy or testimony of the 2 witnesses, during which they're conducting plagues. We have the 42 months that the Gentiles trample Jerusalem in the area outside the temple house, 42 months of the beast's authority when he makes war and overcomes the saints, the release of the beast from the abyss, the casting down of the devil and his angels from heaven, the plagues of chapters 15 and 16, the death of other saints besides the 2 witnesses, the death of the 2 witnesses, the resurrection and rapture of the 2 witnesses, and then the destruction of Babylon the Great by the 10 horns. And then to that we might also add the falling away, although I think we may have to cover that in another adjunct study afterwards, because that involves a discussion more on false prophet and to some extent Babylon the Great and how that falling away is sort of precipitated, like what leads to it, what's the nature of it, and those kinds of questions, which I don't want to get sidetracked. They are very important, but for our study we're focused elsewhere. So to kind of go through this list of 13 or 14 items that I just mentioned, plus a few that you guys have added, I think we should start with some of the major milestone events. And the first one for me is going to be the abomination of desolation. It's sort of a keystone event as it's sort of depicted both in Daniel chapter 9 and chapter 12, and also in chapter 11, I think. Jesus calls out this event in his discussion of end times prophecy, specifically mentioning Daniel. And then we'd have to ask, well, okay, where is this occurring in Revelation? Because that's another whole question. It's hard to see it in Revelation. It's not presented it per se, but as Enoch mentions, 2 Thessalonians, I think it's mentioned there by Paul. So where is this? What is it? I mean, we might ask that. We could do a deep dive on the abomination of desolation. I'm just going to hold that conversation. We'll just say there's this thing called the abomination of desolation, which in a broad sense involves the Antichrist, a human figure, the angelic figure that's referred to in Revelation as the beast. Those two terminologies, those two have some kind of relationship with each other. Some people refer to it as some kind of possession. I'm not sure if that's the right term for it, but one or both of these parties is involved in some kind of desecration or visit to the temple. I'm not sure the extent. We talked about this last week, the extent to which he's able to get into the temple house itself, or if he merely disrupts the activities there by getting to the gates of the temple house. We have to talk about that in the language from Paul and from Daniel and what that indicates. But there's some kind of event that puts a stop to the temple activities, as Daniel 9:27 says, that in the middle of the 7 weeks, he's going to stop. He's going to cease the offering and the sacrifice. So that there seems to be some going on. Revelation indicates a temple in existence, and then it states in that in chapter 11, verse 1, and then in chapter 2, verse 2, it says, and yet the Gentiles will trodden down the city for 42 months. And so that does sort of fit with Daniel 9:27. So this abomination is kind of an important event. Let me tell you why I think this is in the middle. I think everybody places the abomination of desolation in the middle as far as I'm aware. Don't mean to dismiss the possibility that others have it at the end or something, but most people put this particular event of the sacrifices or offerings or activities at the temple being stopped by the Antichrist at the midway point, somewhere at right around the 3.5 years into it, 3.5 years to go. And that comes out of some pretty clear language starting in Daniel 9:27. I mentioned Daniel 9:27 a second ago. It says, let me just pull the text up here and read it. I know I'm never going to get through this chronology stuff in one setting, but it's important. I don't want to just breeze past it and, give my assessment, because that wouldn't help people. People want to know what the Bible says, not what I think. So we want to consider it. So here's verse 27 of Daniel. It says, he will confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. So there's this week of years. It's clearly years here, not a week of days. There's other places, including chapter 12, where this issue comes back up, and we're told that half of this period of time is 1,290 days. So that's 3.5 years. It says in the middle of that week of 7 years, he will cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. For the overspreading of abominations, he will make it desolate, even unto the fulfillment, the consummation, the end, so that which is determined will be poured out upon that which is desolate, or that which desolates, depends on how you read it. So there's that. In the middle of a 7-week period, something happens to suspend temple activities. Let's see. I'm going to go down here to chapter 11, see if it's verse 13. I think it's verse 31. Let me see. Here's chapter 11, verse 31. And arms or some military force of some kind, whether angelic or human or both, will stand up, and they will pollute the sanctuary of strength, and they will take away the daily, whatever the daily temple activities are there, and they will place the abomination that makes desolate, and they will work against the covenant. And then if we go down to chapter 12, we have sort of concluding remark. Go ahead. Does somebody have a comment?
I was just going to clarify one thing. You said that it's a week that's 7 years, right? In the middle.
Your connection's breaking up. It was hard for me to understand what you were saying.
Oh, sorry about that. Period. And you mentioned 7 weeks. I think, did you mean 7 years?
7 years. Sorry, if I said 7 weeks, I misspoke. Thanks.
Yep, it was the week equals 7 years, and then the middle of those 7 years was when this was occurring. I'm just trying to keep it clear, because I know you like to
Yeah, no, that's good. I get going quick and I mess up sometimes, so I appreciate the correction for clarity. All right, so then you go to Daniel chapter 12 as Daniel's being sort of the last bit of information is being conveyed to him. He's told by this angelic figure that's been speaking with him. In verse 7, he says, I heard the man who was clothed in linen, who was upon the rivers of the water. He lifted his right hand and he swore to heaven by him that lives forever and ever, that for a time, times and a half, which is to say 1 year, 2 years and a half a year. So if you add that up, it's 3.5 years. When he will accomplish these things to scatter the power of the holy people. So again, somebody's working to scatter the power of the holy people for a 3.5 year period. And then Daniel continues to ask questions.